Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Moyer, and I'm Zprime's Senior Research and Content Strategist. It is my pleasure to moderate today's webinar presented by Copperleaf, Enterprise Portfolio Management for Utilities, Optimizing Asset Investments to Maximize Value and Drive Strategy. Before I hand things over to our panelists, I want to let you know that we do want you to ask questions during the webinar. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx window to submit questions. Then we'll take some time at the end of the webinar to have our speakers answer as many questions as we have time for. If at any time during the webinar you're having trouble with audio or video, refreshing WebEx or closing out and then signing back in will most likely help. Finally, the slides and webinar recordings will be available after the webinar is complete. So don't worry about missing anything. We usually get them up on our site within a day or two, and you'll receive an email linking you to both the slide deck and webinar playback. On today's webinar, we'll be discussing the results of the Zprime survey on utility portfolio management, the evolution of project portfolio management, enterprise portfolio management for utilities, and an industry case study. Then at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to what you've all come for, which is our great panelists today. Barry Court is the Vice President of Marketing for Copperleaf, and Brett Haney is the Director with PwC's Capital Project Delivery and Asset Management team, and his focus is on portfolio management. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Barry to take us through this conversation.
Thanks, Chris, and hello, everyone. So I'd like to start today's webinar by presenting some of the research that Chris mentioned that Zprime conducted for us earlier this year. And the objective of the research really was to get a utility industry perspective on the challenges that these organizations faced in managing their investment portfolios, and in particular, managing their investment portfolios across the enterprise. So 160 utilities participated in the survey, representing a really good cross-section of the industry. 36% were investor-owned, 35% were munis, 21% were co-ops, and 8% were either district or federal. And also covered all the different types of services provided by the utilities, being electrical, gas, water, wastewater, and solid waste. And also covered the gamut of revenues, anywhere from under $100 million in annual revenue to well over $1 billion. And really, the purpose of the survey was to query respondents on their current challenges in the area of enterprise-wide investment decision-making, the benefits they felt that they could achieve by getting better at it, and also their perspective on the current state of the market with respect to PPM, or project and portfolio management tools, that they were using today in this area. So first, let's look at the challenges and benefits. In the upper left-hand part of the slide, you can see the top challenges. And the top challenge that they noted is that they don't have enough money to do everything that they want to do. So not really a big surprise here, but it does underscore the fact that these organizations can't do everything they're being asked to do, which means that they need to make some pretty tough decisions about what projects they need to execute today and which ones they can afford to defer. You also see that the next challenges are focused around corporate culture and business silos. And effectively, this just means that when they make these trade-off decisions, they need to get all of the stakeholders to be part of the decision-making process and get them all on board. And so it's not surprising to see that the next most important challenge is making sure that they have good, solid business cases and justifications and ROI, because that's really the main method to get people to agree. But another really interesting thing that I noted out of this survey here is that only 5% really felt that they were happy with their current state. So there's a lot of room for improvement. Now over to the benefits, which is in the top right-hand side, you can see that the top benefit they felt they could achieve was improved resource planning and management. Next, they had better risk management, improving the reliability, reducing their cost, and essentially maximizing the value or the contribution of their asset-related investments. So it really boils down to they're looking for ways to improve their business performance while at the same time reducing their costs. Some other interesting things we uncovered through the survey is that the vast majority of the people really wanted to understand how their investment strategies were impacting their business goals, and they also overwhelmingly wanted to move more towards enterprise-wide decision-making. So 90% wanted to understand how their investment strategies were impacting their triple bottom line, which means not only financial performance, but also their environmental performance and their societal performance. 83% wanted to move towards enterprise-wide accountability. They wanted to move away from departmental autonomy and start to make decisions for the benefit of the enterprise as a whole. And 80% felt that this enterprise-wide accountability is just going to increase in importance in the near future. We also noted that very few people were happy with their current PPM toolset, with only 8% feeling that the tools that they had today were helping them in this area. And again, only 5% were happy with their current state. So we will be sending all of you the details of this survey in an email following the webinar, but after reviewing all of the input, Z-Prime distilled the input into 3 top recommendations for utilities wanting to embark on this journey and improve in this area. First, it was to align your decisions to strategy, which essentially means that every member of the organization needs to understand the organization's strategic objectives, and that needs to be broken down into clear goals for each department, and then they need to measure progress against those goals. The second recommendation was to create an enterprise-wide definition of value. This means defining what value means specifically to your organization and across your organization, and to create a corporate value framework to objectively evaluate every investment that's brought forward against this definition of value. This becomes essential when you start trying to make trade-off decisions across organizational boundaries. And last but not least, change management. An initiative of this scope really needs to be championed by the senior leaders in your organization, and a formal change management program will definitely help the company successfully make the journey towards enterprise-wide decision-making. And Brett will highlight the importance of some of these issues when he discusses the case study later in the webinar. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about PPM tools, or project and portfolio management tools, and how these tools are evolving. What we've noticed over the past few years is a definite shift in the needs of large organizations, like utilities, around the need to improve the management of their investment portfolios across their enterprise. So new requirements are appearing from senior executives for cross-enterprise visibility and decision-making, and that in turn is driving the evolution of the solutions in the PPM space. Now, historically, PPM tools were primarily used by project management offices, or PMOs. And PMOs are typically located within the different business units of an organization, and they're responsible for managing the projects within that business unit. So PPM tools were used by these project managers and the PMOs to organize their projects into portfolios and manage the execution of these projects in terms of keeping them on track, in terms of their cost, their schedule, and their achievement of key milestones. However, we see that landscape is changing. In large distributed organizations like utilities, we're starting to see the formation of enterprise PMOs, or EPMOs. And their purpose is really to look across the enterprise and coordinate and integrate the activities of the PMOs in the various business units to drive the optimal benefit for the company overall. In parallel with that, senior executives now want assurance that the projects that they're spending money on are in fact the ones that are helping them drive the organization's strategy. They want to make sure that they're deriving the greatest benefit from their investment portfolios, and they want to better plan and manage the company's resources and make sure those resources are being spent on the right projects at the right time. So these enterprise and executive level needs are really driving the evolution of PPM to include what we're calling enterprise portfolio management. Now, Gartner has published some interesting research related to PPM solutions. You can see the link to the research in the lower right-hand portion of the slide, and we will be copying the link into the chat window if you'd like to copy it for viewing after the webinar. Now, Gartner's view is that PPM is not a single solution, but rather a collection of tools and processes that operate across the organization. And they categorize these tools into 4 discrete layers. The first layer, layer 1, is what they call project collaboration tools. And these are tools used by the broadest number of people within the organization, and they're used to share information about projects that are currently being executed. So this can be things like Microsoft Excel or Word, Trello message boards, email, or even Slack. And these tools help people who are involved in the day-to-day execution of projects communicate and collaborate with others across the company and keep everybody on the same page regarding the state of the projects and what's needed to keep the projects running. The next layer they call work management tools, and these are tools used by project managers and the PMOs to manage and track the execution of projects. These tools help show time spent by individual resources, tracks the cost, shows progress against schedule, and the achievement of milestones. Very typical project management tasks. In this category, we'll find the lighter weight project management tools because these tools are used for projects that are typically shorter in duration, maybe a few months or so. In the third layer, we find more complete project management tools. These tools provide a deeper set of capabilities and are used for more important or more complex projects, those that carry strategic importance or require significant investment in either funding or resources to carry out. And this is where you'll find the bulk of the PPM players today. So while they do a good job of helping manage the planning and execution of complex projects, and they do group them into portfolios, they really don't offer much in terms of helping decide what projects that the organization should be executing. That falls to the tools at the apex of their pyramid. Gartner calls this dynamic portfolio level PPM solutions. And they view this level of solution as independent from the execution level and tailored to the needs of the EPMO and the executives. And these solutions look across the enterprise to help them make decisions about which projects to select to drive the achievement of their strategy, to optimize their portfolios by including projects that maximize the value delivered to the enterprise. And they also help organizations explore different investment strategies by allowing them to do what-if scenarios. And it also allows them to quickly replan to adapt to changes and helps them manage the capacity and demand for resources at an enterprise level. So in other words, this level really enables enterprise portfolio management. So now let's dive a little deeper into enterprise portfolio management through the lens of a utility. As an organization that manages critical infrastructure in an increasingly complex environment with competing priorities, utilities need to make some very difficult investment decisions. They need to ensure that they're properly managing the risk. They need to make sure that they're maximizing the benefit or the value that they're getting out of their investments, all the while meeting their constraints. And they need to focus the resources on the activities that are going to advance the strategic goals of the organization. So one of the key capabilities that utilities need is to optimize their investment portfolios to deliver the most value. So let's talk a little bit about how that might work. So in large asset-intensive organizations like utilities, they invest a substantial amount just to properly sustain and grow their asset base. And these investments are all pooled together into a set of candidate investments that they need to consider. But that's not the only thing that they do. They also have growth projects, modernization initiatives, operational improvements that they need to make. So these too are part of that pool of candidate investments that they need to consider spending their money on. So to make decisions around these projects, the first thing that they need to do is to consistently evaluate all of these projects in terms of the value that they're going to deliver to the organization. However, every organization has its own objectives. Could be reliability targets, safety targets, financial performance, and it also faces real-world constraints, things like available budget, available resources, might have risk requirements from the regulator. So to ensure that the organization is spending money on the right projects at the right time requires that an optimization be performed on the portfolio. Now, optimization is a multi-criteria decision analysis, and what it does is it examines all of the projects in the portfolio and selects the projects in the portfolio that will deliver the most value, drive their objectives, and simultaneously respect the constraints that they face. Now, the cornerstone of this whole process is in the determination of value. Understanding the value that each project delivers is key to first understanding if a project even has merit, but assuming that it does, you then need to understand that value so that you can then make the correct trade-off decisions in the event that you can't afford to do everything. So the question is, what is value? Well, it depends on who you ask. Different people will have different answers. Someone in finance might say it's financial benefit, an engineer might say it's risk mitigation, or a maintenance person might say it's reliability improvement. And obviously, they're all right. So when calculating value, you need to take all of those perspectives into consideration. And you also need to be able to communicate the value of risk mitigation to someone in finance and vice versa. So everyone needs to be comfortable that the value that they see is being properly considered in the valuation of investments. Also, projects that contribute to advancing an organization strategy should also be valued accordingly. And since executing a project today or executing that same project next year may deliver very different value, you need to understand the real impact of deferring each investment so that you can make the right decisions about what needs to be done now and what can wait. So our approach to solving this problem is to develop a corporate or enterprise-wide value framework. So an enterprise-wide value framework is a means to assess every project in terms of how it contributes to the things that you identify as being of value to your company. So a value framework includes value measures that you define for every benefit that you want to consider. This can be things such as different types of risk mitigation or reliability improvements or financial benefits. And all of these measures are combined into a framework, and every investment is evaluated in terms of how it contributes to each of those value measures. It's also best practice to include at least one value measure for each of the company's strategic objectives so that you can measure how investments are actually advancing those objectives. Now, for utilities and other asset-intensive organizations, risk is a very important thing to measure and to proactively manage. However, there's two types of risk, operational risk and execution risk. And typically, PPM solutions help manage operational risk. Now, execution risk. And execution risk describes the risks of projects overrunning or the cost of delays. However, typical PPMs don't deal very well with operational risk. And for asset-intensive organizations like utilities, operational risk is key. In fact, projects are created to mitigate this type of risk and to keep assets operating and productive. So understanding and managing this risk is critical for utilities to develop an optimal investment plan. And operational risk is a bit unique, basically because it varies with time. The more an asset ages, the more likely it is to fail, and therefore the more operational risk it exposes the organization to. In this example, we're showing how an asset risk is increasing with time. And as the risk approaches the unacceptable level, a project is undertaken, which then puts a new asset in service. And this then resets the risk the level of that of a new asset. And that gray area shows the risk that was avoided by this project, which is one of the components of value of this investment. Now you can see that if we defer this project, that the organization is now exposed to a significant amount of operational risk due to that deferral, which ultimately reduces the net value of that investment. Similarly, if a project is brought forward and the asset is replaced too early, again, you can see that the value is reduced. So given that operational risk and by extension value are so dependent on time, it's critical for utilities that their value assessment understand how each project's value varies with time so that the right trade-off decisions are made when deciding what projects to select and which they can defer if they need to meet budgetary or other constraints. Now, making portfolio-level decisions can be done either at a departmental level as well as at an enterprise level. And making the trade-off decisions across the enterprise is typically what I like to call a journey of discovery. So many organizations start that journey by proving out the process in one department, as shown here. So they'll use their traditional methods to allocate funds between the different departments and then optimize the portfolio within a single department to develop their initial value framework, test out and refine their processes, and really prove the value of this method. And assuming that that goes well, the next step is to extend the value framework to encompass the needs of multiple departments. So at this stage, they're still optimizing each department locally, but it's within the agreed budgets that were set at the corporate level. This incremental approach allows them to build their corporate value framework and scale their processes across all of their different departments. And now the final step in the journey is really to optimize spend at the corporate level. Now they're looking across the needs of all the departments and shifting the spend between departments based on the overall benefit to the organization as a whole. Now, this step-by-step approach builds trust in the value framework across all the departments and ensures that everybody understands that these decisions are in fact best overall for the organization. So to summarize, for asset-intensive organizations such as utilities, enterprise portfolio management really requires a combination of things. First, it requires a solution that can act as what Gartner refers to as their dynamic portfolio level PPM, but it also requires an enterprise value framework that can comprehensively assess value and understands the time-sensitive nature of operational risk. And it also uses a value-based optimization capability that can help it align portfolios to the strategic goals of the company, deliver the most value for the constraints that it faces, enable their journey from optimal decision-making, starting at a departmental level and then reaching across the enterprise, and also enable scenario analysis to explore the outcomes of different investment strategies, and finally optimize the resource usage and capacity planning. So now what I'd like to do is hand control over to Brett Haney, who's the Director of Capital Projects and Infrastructure at PwC. And Brett will walk you through a utility case study where he had firsthand experience guiding a utility through this exact journey. So over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Barry. So as Barry mentioned, I'd like to share a case study of a current client's journey as they look to adopt Copperleaf CP5 as an enterprise portfolio management solution. Starting with the project drivers and the approach and continuing with a Ppm Tools rationalization that we assisted with, aligned with the Gartner research Barry presented earlier, and wrapping up with an overview of their journey. So our engagement began with an assessment, actually, of the client's ERP, and specifically project accounting and portfolio management capabilities that were being delivered through a combination of Oracle EBS and PowerPlan project or portfolio module. The current state assessment identified multiple pain points related to both people, process, and the tools that they were using. First of all, project prioritization, the processes were inconsistent, and it was very weakly linked back to the strategic objectives of the company. They also focused primarily on financial benefits and resulted in less effective use of capital. The portfolio management practices were largely manual, dependent on individual talent, and did not scale to meet increasing requirements or recommendations coming out of an internal audit. Lastly, portfolio target setting was largely based on past performance. It was historical values plus a certain percentage, and didn't easily adjust or adapt to changing needs. And all of this was delivered through highly customized software and technology solutions using multiple applications that were not well integrated. So as we built out an approach, we focused on several key themes. And the first was looking at moving towards optimizing portfolios instead of advocacy-based prioritization, and using a common value framework across the entire enterprise. The second was increasing efficiency by re-engineering processes, rationalizing the tool landscape, removing redundant functionality, and standardizing data structures to make integrations more efficient and reporting more robust. And then we look to leverage technology by adopting a best-of-breed of commercial off-the-shelf tools, removing custom applications, and reducing technical debt. In addition to that, we wanted to move beyond query-based reporting and take advantage of analytic capabilities of the BI tools that the client already had. So tying back to the Gartner research that Barry opened with, we identified and reviewed applications used across the entire life cycle of an investment or a project within each of the business units. And one of the first things you notice on this slide is just the sheer number of applications used across the enterprise and the predominance of Microsoft Excel and spreadsheets. Around the time we began our assessment, one of the business units, which was their non-nuclear generation BU, had completed an implementation of Copperleaf C55 within their specific business unit. In addition to that, there were several other PPM initiatives that were underway focused on project execution, specifically in scheduling and cost management and project controls. As part of our approach, we set out to rationalize the applications and completed a fit gap analysis for the new enterprise portfolio management tool for the company. That completed with a recommendation to adopt C55 for both asset management planning and portfolio management, developing robust portfolio management reporting out of the C55 reporting data store using the business intelligence applications. And this was the level 4 dynamic PPM layer from the Gartner research. As I mentioned before, there were other projects underway at the client, so we looked to integrate and remove redundancy between those projects, and that was more around the level 3 in the mature execution tools, and that included a new enterprise deployment of Primavera P6, as well as implementing Eco6 for enterprise cost management and project controls. So Barry talked a little bit before about the journey and the process and moving from a business unit to the enterprise. So that's the exact journey that we've been on with this client for a while now. As I mentioned before, they started with the implementation of C55 within a specific business unit, and we're using a value framework for developing and planning their portfolios and optimizing their portfolios within that BU. We started our analysis in late 2017 and concluded with the fit gap that I mentioned that was coordinated with the other projects going on within the company that settled on the final landscape across the investment lifecycle. Coming out of that, we started the first stages of design for this project, and we started off with a pilot of the C55 value framework across the entire enterprise, and we took a little bit of a unique approach here. And instead of taking the pilot of the value framework across every project in the enterprise, the organization responsible for setting capital targets held back approximately 5% of the capital portfolio and created what they called the Enterprise Competition Fund that was then allocated using competing investments against the value framework. And we were able to use this to really expose all of the other business units to the value framework, test assumptions that were going into this, and come up with gaps that needed to be closed as we moved towards rolling out the value framework across the entire enterprise. In addition to that, we looked at the first steps around standardizing data and really taking a look at how data structures were held in various systems across the enterprise and did a lot of work to align those so that project numbers and other things were more consistently used across systems to facilitate the future integrations and also begin to enhance reporting capabilities out of the bat. Both of those releases occurred in the first and the second quarter of this year, respectively. And with a third release that will be going live at the beginning of November, and that is Enterprise Portfolio Management and Copperleaf C55. So this is where we've taken what we're calling version 2.0 of the value framework and rolling that out across the entire enterprise, in addition to standardized and redesigned processes to assist the business units in planning their portfolio and rolling that up to the enterprise portfolio. In addition to the process work and the value framework, we've also developed integrations to bring back actuals and current forecasts to C55 to facilitate scenario analysis and replanning portfolios, and provided their portfolio managers with the ability to push their portfolio forecast on a monthly basis to the corporate forecast through a roll-up process. So like I mentioned, all of that will be implemented in live by the beginning of November to support their next fiscal year of planning. And the next steps on the horizon are to continue, and we're looking next at further integrating C55 into the investment lifecycle. And now that we've built out our, quote, business cases and quantified the benefits of each of the investments, developed a high-level estimate, we want to integrate that into the actual funding authorization process so that that can then be used to approve the project funding and then move that into an execution stage. So with that comes a re-engineering and really redesign of the funding authorization process and looking at the correct steps and how that should function, as well as integrating it into the tool landscape when we get into execution space, so that we're initiating and creating a project from Copperleaf C55 and then propagating that information across the other various accounting and execution tools in the landscape so that we have a better user experience, better data quality, and a more seamless experience. So those are currently under planning, with set to start design in the third quarter of this year and go live at the beginning of the third quarter of next year. So that's an overview of the case study. As Barry mentioned before, sort of running along this entire journey, there's been a fairly substantial component of organizational change management and training. So we have a full-time dedicated team to helping us manage communications and change throughout the agency. This is a fairly major shift for them as you start to look at changing how capital targets are allocated to business units and how funding is allocated to the investments within the business unit. In addition, there's a fairly significant upskilling that we've been working to support both within portfolio managers and portfolio space, but also within the business units, and helping them understand what it takes to develop a better business case towards the beginning of the life cycle, understanding what it means to quantify benefits and understanding, what really the outcomes are of each of the investments that they're putting forward. So like I said, that's the journey that they've been on. It's almost a 2-year journey from beginning to end as we move them step by step from a single business unit to the enterprise, and then ultimately enable them to start looking at dynamic target setting between business units. So with that, Chris, I guess I will hand it back to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both, Brett and Barry, for just a really enthralling presentation. We have some great questions that have come in from the audience, and I wanted to get that started with just kind of a kickoff question that maybe both of you can address, and that is, the corporate value framework sounds very interesting, though it also sounds like it could be quite a lot of work. Can both of you talk a little bit about what is needed to build a value framework?
Sure, I can start, and then maybe Brett can give a little bit of perspective from how that was carried out in the project. And you're correct. I mean, the building of the value framework is a key part of this whole process. And so it typically requires that we sit down with all the stakeholders within a given department, within an organization, because typically you start small within a department and build a value framework there. And then, through discussions, understand the different types of value that they need to measure and what they're doing today in terms of measuring that value, if they have current methods or not. And we also have been accumulating over the past number of years a library of value measures that we're able to use. And this library encompasses value measures that have been used in the electrical, gas, water, and IT industries. So it's an ever-growing kind of body of knowledge around the different value measures that people could potentially use within their value framework, and it really allows them to leverage best practice from other organizations in their industry. But effectively, the process really comprises sitting down with the stakeholders, identifying the different value measures, seeing if those value measures already exist in the library. If not, then we can create them specifically for them. And then really it's an iterative process where investments are run through the value measure, or the value framework. Everyone looks at the output, decides whether or not that output is reasonable, right? And then we put a number of investments through, and we look at the relative value of those investments to make sure that they're relatively positioned properly. And effectively, it's an ongoing process to build that value framework and ensure that all the stakeholders that are involved are comfortable that the value that's being represented by the value framework is actually representative of what they would expect to see, and that it makes sense to them. So it's a collaborative process. And as we expand beyond the initial department, then new value measures are brought in and new participants join in the process. So it really is an incremental process as we expand the value framework out across the organization. Brett, maybe you could talk a little bit about how that was handled.
Sure. So on the case study that I mentioned, much to what Barry started with, we started with taking a look at what the strategic objectives were for the company, and then started to look at how you would define value against each one of those objectives, and then what the measurable KPIs and metrics were against each one of those. So based on that, we then went to the Copperleaf Value Framework Library with Copperleaf, found a models and measures that already existed, in addition to the value framework that was in place from the non-nuclear generation, and then began to iterate on those. So as we looked to bring on different business units that were maybe non-generating business units, we had new areas of value that hadn't necessarily been considered before. So in generation, it was about asset risk, loss generation, other very asset-centric values. However, when we started having conversations with HR, IT, facilities, we started talking a lot more about employee engagement. We started talking about employee attraction and some more softer benefits and how we could begin to quantify those. So each one of those was then developed with a series of questionnaires and inputs that were then used to define value for each of those value measures.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Barry. I'd kind of like to explore this case study a little bit. We've had a couple questions that have come in, and I'm going to try to combine them into one overarching topic here. But the basic framework, one of the questions was, what's the largest challenge with this initiative? And furthermore, to add on to that, this case study really appears to be an example of a prioritization of projects. Our audience wants to know, is that correct? And can a risk analysis be done at the asset level to first define the projects and then ultimately prioritize them?
Okay. So I would say one of the largest challenges was really around the organizational change management across the businesses and the different levels of maturity across business units. So when you look at sort of the disparity of an organization, and you might have an HR organization that does one project every 5 years compared to a generation organization that does hundreds of projects every year and has really robust project management practices, and then stack that up against maybe a facilities organization that has a handful of small projects and fairly immature project management practices, trying to align those and find a common denominator is one of the bigger challenges. So you're really deep into business unit specific processes and looking for ways to align those and move those through so that you're getting a like-for-like comparison amongst investment requests. I think there are a couple parts. So the next part was around prioritization. So we actually are pushing towards optimization, and when we talk about optimization, it's looking at the best portfolio given a set of constraints. And in this specific instance, they're looking at constraints being driven by financial constraints. They're looking at constraints based on project dependencies, and they're also looking at constraints due to planned maintenance outages and optimizing the portfolio based on those, given different changes in project value over time, driven where available by asset information. So I think that ties to the third part, which is around the asset-specific risk analysis. So we do have a handful of value models. So the value models are the generic calculators that calculate the value for us that are driven based on asset condition or asset risk. So we do have an integration with their asset management system to pull asset condition back to help with that calculation. And then we also have generic asset models where we may not have asset data available from an asset management system, or for business units that don't use that asset management system, to allow them to map asset condition back to kind of a generic asset condition score based on an inspection or the relative age of that asset compared to its design life.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. One of the first parts of that answer, Brett, was you were talking about change management. And I know that you addressed that, but we've had a couple questions in the audience specifically about the process of change management, and you addressed how it could be different for organizations that routinely have to undergo these types of asset examinations. But from your experience, is there a magic number for the time period allocated for each phase of the change management process? Or is it really dependent on the exact type of project and process that is trying to be put in place?
So I don't know that there's a magic number per se, but there's a couple of things that were really crucial to the success from a change management perspective. And the first is the executive leadership and leadership buy-in. So the project that I presented in the case study was sponsored by the CFO. The day-to-day executive sponsor was the VP of financial operations. And that strong leadership from the top really helped around that. The other thing that we did is when I went through the journey slide, you saw that there were multiple sort of times when we were introducing smaller, more incremental changes and developing sort of this release strategy, which allowed us to do a couple of things. The change was smaller, more manageable, and more of a bite-sized approach. The other thing that did is it allowed us to learn from each step along the way and iterate through the solution to make sure that we were able to take into account and demonstrate that we were learning as we went through this and learning new ways to accommodate sort of the nuances of each of the business units. So instead of trying to eat the elephant in one bite, we chose to eat it one bite at a time in smaller bites that were a lot more digestible at the BU level.
That's great. Barry, do you have any thoughts on change management overall and how that plays into the PPM process?
I think Brett covered it very well. I think, as you pointed out, I think the executive support is key. And then I think just the continuous kind of monitoring of progress within the organization and ensuring that programs are set up that not only enforce the process, but actually incent people to participate in the process. And the Enterprise Compete Fund that Brett mentioned, I think it was an excellent example of how an organization actually, used the system and the process to actually provide benefit to the different groups. They could compete for additional funding based on making sure that their projects were entered into the system and that the value was properly reflected and really it encouraged people to participate in the process and work with the system. So I think having initiatives like that incent people within the organization to participate is an important part of any change management program.
Great. I'd like to take a step back and maybe look at this again from the 10,000 to 20,000 foot level here. And from the perspective of both of you, does the project portfolio management evolution include enterprise-wide dynamic collaboration tools? And are there any really good examples of some cloud-based tools that either of you would recommend?
So in terms of the dynamic portfolio level solutions, there really are very few on the market today, to be honest with you. Now, obviously, Copperleaf C55 is a good example of one. However, when we're looking at the needs of utilities and, the specific needs of asset-intensive organizations, it's really not just about having that dynamic level PPM capability, but it's also about having that value framework that understands the dynamic nature of operational risk, and then having that optimization capability, which really looks at all of the investments in the portfolio and based on the constraints that you face and the value and the dynamic nature of that value, is able to determine an optimized portfolio that really delivers the most value. So really it's a combination of those three things that I think are really important for any asset-intensive organization when it's considering looking at kind of doing the best management of their portfolios, either within a department or even across the entire enterprise.
Thanks, Barry. Would it be possible to clarify the difference in the challenge in PPM for utility industries versus other infrastructure-heavy industries such as telecom operators?
I think the challenges are quite similar, although the value frameworks would probably look quite different. What we've noted is that as we go from industry to industry, each one of those industries has a different set of assets, it has a different set of challenges, it has a different set of objectives, and that drives a different set of value measures and conversely a different set of value models. So as you go into different industries, you end up learning quite a bit about their specific challenges and developing value models and value measures that help them measure their progress against those challenges. When you think of something like Telecom, their assets are relatively short-lived when you compare to an electric utility whose assets might have a lifetime of 50-plus years. In the telecom industry, technological obsolescence could require the replacement of an asset in 5 or 10 years. And so, the decision-making is slightly different, but the principles are the same, right? You need a value framework. You need to understand the different types of value that you want to measure, and you need to understand the dynamic nature of that value. And then you need to look at all of the things in your portfolio, and for the constraints that you face, you need to come up with the right solution that's going to deliver the most value.
We've had several questions about the value definition process, and both kind of coming at it from the perspective of which is more effective, top-down versus mission-driven versus throughout bottom-up. Can both of you talk to me a little bit about how you conceptualize the value definition process and what are the most effective ways of implementing that?
So I think there's two aspects to it, right? There is the bottom-up definition that we talked about earlier, that Brett touched on earlier, which is understanding the risk in all the individual assets and kind of bubbling all of those needs up to understand what the organization needs to do to effectively, sustain and manage all of their assets in addition to all of the other investments that they're being required to do. And that's really a bottom-up exercise that establishes the needs. But it really needs to be combined with a top-down exercise, which really is more of a constraint question, right? You can't afford to do everything. And you may have resource-based constraints, or you may have timing constraints. And so all of these constraints really need to be looked at from the top down, and then you need to look at all of these needs that were bubbled up from the assets, and then from a top-down level, understand which ones are supporting your strategy, which ones are delivering the most value, and for the constraints that you have, what's the optimal set that you can execute today, and which ones can you defer later that will effectively do the best job in terms of managing risk and improving the performance of your organization. So I think it's a combination of bottom-up as well as top-down to really get the right answer.
Brett, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really think what Barry said is spot on there. It's a combination of the two, and it's when we start looking at what drives value to a company, it really is more of a top-down, mission-driven approach. But when we look at actually the value of a portfolio, it is starting with, in some cases, even down at the asset level, and beginning to roll that up and aggregate that to the portfolio level, and then having the ability to look at as the value to a company changes, whether that's based on regulatory environment, financial constraints, or others, is to look at what the impact of those changing values or changing constraints are on the plan or on the portfolio.
That makes a lot of sense. This is a tricky question, a little bit of a philosophical question, but I think a very, very good one from our audience. How do you eliminate bias and subjectivity when organizations may not initially have a robust method for tracking and analyzing specific data?
So that is a great question, and actually one of the most important things that you need to do in this whole process is seek to eliminate bias, because human beings tend to be quite biased animals. One of the things that we use is, Brett talked about these value models as being kind of the calculators of value. So we ensure that we build a value model for calculating, let's say, a certain type of risk, and then we ensure that all the different people within the organization that are evaluating that type of risk are in fact using that value model. So we seek consistency through ensuring that we define a model that is used by all. The other way that people can tend to be biased is the inputs to the model. And so what we recommend and what we use are questionnaires that are actually laid out in working knowledge or working language, right? So how many outage hours is this investment meant to avoid? Things like that, so that, when people are looking in and reviewing that investment, then it's a lot easier to understand exactly what assumptions were made, and that those assumptions were in fact reasonable and accurate. So by having a standard set of calculations that are used across the system, a standard set of things like financial parameters and a standardized risk matrix also ensures that there's less variability across the different departments. And again, those questionnaires in working language also help to ensure that the assumptions made and that the calculations are in fact consistent and defensible.
So Barry, just to sort of to piggyback on that, we jokingly make sure that the value models are designed in a way to where you have to show your work if you think back to the grade school days. But and to your point, it's making sure that we're not asking you what maybe the O&M savings are. We're asking you if it's a labor-based savings, how many hours are being saved and how many employees does that affect, so that you can really start to drive to that and look at what's driving that value.
Well, that's great. And we did have multiple questions about handling bad data or missing data, trying to eliminate subjectivity, and so I called out just one of those questions, but I do want to acknowledge the audience that several people in the audience asked questions about that very topic, and I hope that was comprehensive enough to answer that. We also had a few people interested in finding out more about the value measures library. Brett or Barry, can you speak to the audience about that briefly?
So the value framework library is actually, as I mentioned before, kind of an ever-evolving library of value models and value measures that we use when we implement C55 with all of our customers. And so that library is available to all C55 users, and they can look at that library and effectively add in additional value models or value measures to their framework as they evolve it over time. We're also introducing a brand new product over the next couple of months called Copperleaf Value, which will essentially be an online resource that will allow C55 customers to browse the library and kind of inspect the different value models and understand how the value models work, et cetera. So it'll be a way for them to continuously stay abreast of kind of the new value models in the library and effectively adopt those value models or value measures as necessary to keep their value framework in tune with their evolving business needs, and also to keep them in tune with industry best practice.
Thanks, Barry. And thank you to Brett as well. Both of you did just a fantastic job exploring both from the high level and very specifically things that utilities can do to make a really profound impact on the asset planning. I just want to thank everyone for attending today. And as a quick reminder, you will receive an email within the next couple of days with links to the webinar presentation and a webinar playback link. If you have any other questions, you can always reach us at info@zprime.com. And thank you again to Copperleaf for presenting this webinar. I wanted to mention that for those interested in more information from the survey that we did, that will be published fully shortly, and you can look for that either from zPrime or from Copperleaf. We've had a really great time today on this webinar, and we really appreciate you tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. All the best.